So good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Darville, for those of you that don't know me, and currently the Chief of the Engineer Personnel Development Office. It is my great pleasure today to, on behalf of General Raymer, the Commandant of the Engineer School, introduce our guest speaker for the third quarter event of the U.S. Army Engineer School Speaker Program. So our topic today is resilience. And the resilience that we're going to talk about is in a much different context from the resilience that most of you will be familiar with. So if you thought we were going to talk about how to get a better night's sleep, how to deal with stress, how to kind of roll with the punches and complete the mission, that's not exactly what we're going to talk about, although it is very much related, right? So what we're going to talk about today, what we're going to learn about is how we design resiliency into the built environment. And right now it's very important topic for the Department of Defense and for the Army, because we've seen cases where military installations have not been able to function after disasters. We've seen cases where training rotations at NTC have had to be canceled because of heavy rains. We've seen cases where Navy bases have to be redesigned or remodeled because of rising sea level. We've seen cases where engineers have had to respond to disasters domestically and abroad because of poorly designed built environment from a resiliency perspective. And we've also seen more and more how host nation governments have been unable to respond to disasters in their own countries, which causes civil unrest and destabilizes countries, and then indirectly can contribute to harboring terrorists and things like that. So the more we learn about resiliency, the more we realize how important it is to us in the Department of Defense and the Army, and especially for Army engineers. So Mr. Ripple is a founding partner of an architecture firm from New Orleans, Louisiana, known as S.K. Dumez and Ripple, or EDR. And after Hurricane Katrina, the firm and its employees, along as well as most of the citizens and their clients, were displaced out of New Orleans. And so really it was a kind of watershed moment that caused them to rethink how they operated their firm, what their business model was, what their strategy was, and how they designed their projects for their clients. And in the process of that, they became some of the experts in the country at resilient design. And so with a lot of what they've learned, they've written something called the Framework for Resilient Design. And Mark has spoken at various venues across the country. And for their work, the American Institute of Architects named them the Firm of the Year nationally in 2014. And Mark was recently named a fellow with the American Institute of Architects. So we're very, very fortunate to be able to have him here to discuss this with us today. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Ripple.
Thank you, Hugh. Hello, folks. I'm mic'd up with two mics. Everybody can hear me okay? We did find that whoever used the room last must have taken the remote control with them, so we're going to do the unsophisticated. It's some message there about technology. I'm going to wave my hand to Paul in the back when we're ready to advance the slides. Thanks so much for the introduction. Our firm has been in existence for 26 years. I'm a native New Orleanian. The original founding partner, Alan Eskew, passed away 3 years ago. Steve Dumez is actually, I'm born and raised in New Orleans. Believe it or not, there are places further south from New Orleans. Steve Dumez is from Houma, Louisiana, which is one of those, when you look at the sea level rise predictions, Houma would be either, depending on which one you look at, either an island or non-existent. So we're very much looking at, we're right in the sort of the crosshairs of issues of sea level rise, issues of coastal subsidence, and nowhere in this hemisphere is it more pronounced than in coastal New Orleans. We had you can talk about theoretical exercises. We had the ultimate empirical exercises. What happens when a Category 5 storm comes in and inundates a major metropolitan area in a low-lying area that's subject to these kind of catastrophes. Well, we found out firsthand what that means. There's some aspects of this that may hit home, others not so much, but I think it is important. The perspective that we bring is how does resiliency affect communities? In some cases, we were talking this morning, well, I guess you'd need to build a resilient tarmac or some other facility out in a remote area or on an island or somewhere where people aren't around. But so much of what we deal with in resiliency and even coastal resiliency requires thinking about the human aspect of it, the social aspect and the cultural aspect of it. And so much of that message is infused in the presentation. Next slide. This is us. We think we live in the greatest city on the planet, which is New Orleans, and we know we live next to one of the greatest rivers in the world, the Mississippi River, and at the convergence of those two is where our studio is. We're literally at the foot of Canal Street. If you're familiar with New Orleans, right next to the French Quarter, at the foot of Canal Street by the river, there's the aquarium and there's a high-rise building. We're at the top floor of that, so we like to think we're sort of like to think of ourselves as master and commander of all that happens in New Orleans, but we certainly have a great view of the city from there. Next slide. A lot of things happened after Katrina. One of them was an amazing, at the point where the rest of the country was in an economic downturn from 2008 to 2012, we were in our upswing because we were the recipient of tens of billions of recovery dollars. And what that brought with the money was an amazing infusion of young entrepreneurial talent to the city, and we're the beneficiary of a lot of it. The statistics were not true prior to Katrina. We're a much more diverse, much younger firm than we were 10 years ago. Next slide. And as you had mentioned, very proud to say we're the 2014 Firm of the Year. The only firm, really, we don't count Texas because they're their own nation, but basically Gulf South, we're the only Gulf South firm to have received the award. Most of them, of course, as you'd expect, would be on the East Coast. Next slide. I love this slide. This is my home. This is where I live, and it is a slide that more than you always see pictures of the French Quarter, Mardi Gras. To me, this captures the essence of New Orleans. It is this tiny little oasis in the middle of water, and you can really get, from the satellite view, you can really get a sense of how fragile the environmental condition is. Most notably, we'll talk about it in a second, that's the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which was carved out in the 1960s, primarily to support commerce for the city, with very little understanding of the environmental and ecological impact. The other one that peels off over here is the Intercoastal Waterway. Not so coincidentally, when Hurricane Katrina hit the city, you heard about the Lower Ninth Ward, it's right there. So after the fact, it's like, God, what an obvious thing after the fact. We carve out a big waterway here, build a levee on that side, carve out a big waterway, build a levee on that side. What we've created is this amazing wedge. So all the water comes in. Water was estimated to be moving, I think it was about 2 feet per second here. By the time it got there, it was 12 feet per second. One of the misrepresentations of Katrina, Lower Ninth Ward actually was high enough in terms of its elevation to not require federal flood insurance. What was unanticipated is the surge of water that would go right there and completely flooded that area, amongst other problems with the city. But I really love the slide because it just shows, we're dealing with very fragile environments, New Orleans being maybe at the apex of that. Next slide. The city was founded in this spot along the Mississippi for very specific reasons. It was the high ground because, of course, anybody knows that with a river with a heavy turn, you get a lot of the dumping of soils at this side of the turn. But also, this waterway was critical. That's Bayou St. John, Lake Pontchartrain were wedged between a river and a lake. And the French recognized that this was a great opportunity to be able to connect with commerce, with their boats, to Lake Pontchartrain and on to Mississippi and Alabama, the settlements of Mobile and Biloxi. and Bay St. Louis, but also to control the Mississippi River. We'll touch on that in a second. Next slide. In the 19th century, throughout the 1800s, we like to think that people got it and they understood what it meant to build in such a dangerous condition. We're filled with swamps, mosquitoes, heavy rainfall, unpredictable flooding, and hurricanes. 300 years later, all of those things are still true. None of that has changed one iota. In the 1800s, the architectural response was very much a response to those conditions. The developers, this is a plantation home in the Mississippi, built off the ground to accommodate water, moisture, critters, vermin, whatever, built very responsive site conditions to capture breezes. You could sit out on the porch if it was too hot inside, et cetera, et cetera. But mostly we built high. Next slide. By the 1850s to 1880s, most of the city was developed along the river because, that's where the high ground was. That's what you do. You build where it's high. You don't build in the swamps in the middle of the city, and you don't build in the outlying swamps. So it was very much a response to the climate and the environment that they were faced with. Next. And they did dumb, simple things. Some of the most beautiful parks, Audubon Park and City Park, they were starting with swampland. This is kind of a dumb diagram, but before it was just swampland that was unusable. So they did the simple thing. They dug out of the swamp, they carved out these beautiful bayous, they piled the dirt on the side and ended up capturing space. So simple, obvious, sustainable means of dealing with messy, swampy conditions. Next. I love this slide because it's some goofy New Orleans and South Louisiana things, but it shows, people tried building fish camps before, and they kept getting washed away. So people started putting, little trailers on barges because, when the water gets high, it goes up, and when it goes down, it goes back down again. I'm not sure what it means to make a boat out of a table, an upside-down table. But I love the guy in the corner. It's like, okay, what do we do as designers? We use creativity and ingenuity to solve problems. He obviously wanted to get from point A to point B. Maybe it was just one side of the bayou to the other. So he had some foam. He had a nice little, Walmart lawn chair. Had a little, 2-volt little mini trolling motor and a battery, and he's done. So that's what we're still doing today, is looking at resources that we've got, optimizing those resources, which is all that sustainability is about, is just simply taking the resources we got and putting them to the best possible use and using them smartly and carefully to achieve an objective. But it mostly involves ingenuity and a constant rethinking, sometimes redefining of the problem. Next. So along comes the 20th century, industrial technology, the Industrial Revolution, and we recognize that we have a different attitude about nature. We're no longer working with nature. We can conquer nature. We can harness nature. We can put it to greater use by taking control over it. In New Orleans, there were 3 major things that affected the development of the city. We were actually, believe it or not, at cutting-edge technology in New Orleans. A guy named Baldwin Wood developed this screw pump that was used at the Sewage and Water Board that essentially pumped all of the surrounding swamps in the city of New Orleans dry, which is like, oh great, we got a lot of free land here now that is developable for a city that was very much in need of development. Of course, most of you know the history of the channelization of the Mississippi River and the decision to use levees to be able to improve commerce. And with New Orleans, what it meant was a lot of flood walls, because essentially it's a city that in some cases was at or below sea level. This book should be required reading for everybody or anybody that is interested in coastal sustainability, and certainly everybody with, if you walk away with one thing, it would be, I need to get out of here and go read this book. It's phenomenal because it talks about the history of the development of a levees-only philosophy, but it goes beyond that. It shows how, gee whiz, there's a thing called politics, that sometimes the best ideas don't always win, because with any large organization like the military, there's a political component that sometimes steers it in a different direction. Maybe that sounds familiar to a couple of you guys. And finally, though, it talks about the social aspect, not just where, this is about the 1927 flood, not just where the original flood happened, the breaching of the flood walls, but how it affected the social and demographic condition in New Orleans as well. So it was the first book that I've seen that really ties issues of resilience to that there's a bigger social message and that people are involved. And when people are involved, it's no longer just about technology. It's much more complicated than that. Next. Next slide. Speaking of technology. Did I say there's technology involved? So I'll continue on. The punchline here is, of course, Hurricane Katrina, where all of these conditions came into play. I like to say that the greatest law in the universe is the law of unintended consequences. And for us as designers, as builders, as engineers, the unintended consequences of what we do create is a constantly changing dynamic condition. The unintended consequence of pumping an entire marsh area dry was that we lost anywhere from 4 to 8 feet of elevation. Think of a sponge. And it's like, well, after the fact, well, duh, that's pretty obvious. You had swampy water, swampy land that after it was pumped dry, it just like a sponge does when it's wet, and then when it dries, it actually compresses. The soil, the hydrostatic, I'm not an engineer, but the hydrostatic pressure, the issues associated with the soil kept it at a certain elevation. So there were areas that were built in the early 1900s in New Orleans that were at or near sea level, including where my house is, which got 6 feet of water in the house and 10 feet in the street. Went from at sea level to anywhere to 6 to 7 feet below sea level over a period of 40 to 50 years. So what we found, and then a levee system and a flood wall system that was designed to compartmentalize the water in the city of New Orleans, of course, was expected to hold, and it did not. So what it showed is there's a slide that shows a couple things that we touched on, that we certainly learned absolutely, after Katrina in New Orleans, which is number one, that nature does not always cooperate, and that we're dealing with, number two, that we're dealing with a dynamic rather than a static condition. A friend of mine used a great analogy, said after Katrina, it was like trying to solve a complicated math problem, except the entire math problem was nothing but variables. There was nothing fixed in the equation. And I really do believe that's what we're dealing with. In New Orleans, we're dealing with continued subsidence. 100 years after they pumped the city dry, we're still dealing with a lower elevation. We're dealing with absolutely unpredicted loss of wetlands due to a lot of dynamic conditions. We're dealing with sea level rise that wasn't even a part of the conversation when I started my career 35 years ago. We're dealing with more intense storms, and then we're dealing with trying to build an infrastructure that is subject to human error. And all of those things, I think, were unknown, or not unknown, they weren't at the forefront of our thinking 40 or 50 or 60 years ago, and they necessarily need to be at the forefront of our thinking now. Yes, yes, yes. Yes.
You can build the most resilient, the most protected, but you really also come down to the cost of the
That's right. Yeah.
It's really a balance of the fortress versus what's aesthetic with the public ones and
Yeah. So the comment was, doesn't it come down to money? As we know, it always comes down to money. One of the things that we found after New Orleans, and this was painful, you've just lost your house, your job, your family, your friends, your kids' school, your church, your community, and what you're hearing from folks is, what the hell were you doing living down there? You were stupid, you should have moved out. Who lives in a city below sea level? What changed, and there was a lot of painful conversation across the country about, well, what do we do about New Orleans other than tell them to please move? And I'll get to a more direct answer in a minute. For us, what changed the dynamic was Hurricane Sandy. Nobody at that point said, well, what were 12 million New Yorkers doing living in New York? Nobody said, well, that's stupid, they should have lived there. As Boston is looking at the impact of a 100-year storm, nobody's saying everybody in Boston needs to move out. So the short answer is what was thought of as perhaps in 2005 as a problem just more narrowly defined, New Orleans, maybe Miami, some of the coastal cities in Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi became more largely understood as a national problem. And there's a slide we show that actually shows when you look at hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, all of the issues that we're dealing with as a country, there are very few parts of the country that can say, well, hey, I'm living in a safe zone, the rest of you guys should move out. Money always comes into play because at some point there is a fatigue factor. We said, the bad joke in New Orleans was if we do in fact, if this ever happens a second time, people will then say, get the heck out of there. You shouldn't have been there to begin with. So there is definitely a fatigue factor, and it comes down to particularly in eras of incredible difficulty in balancing budgets about money. What we're pushing toward is a resiliency that inherently understands that there are a lot of resilient conditions and techniques that can be used that don't cost lots of money. I'll give you an example, a couple different examples. One is we did a building in New Orleans that in phase one, we did it based on just minimum energy standards. So we designed emergency power that because the energy consumption of the building was fairly large, the emergency power as a percentage of the budget that we provided could only provide for critical systems. The phase two, exact same program, this was an SPCA facility for animals. We found out after the storm, 42% of the people that were there, that stayed in New Orleans, that did not evacuate, the number one reason they gave is they had no place to put their pets, and they wouldn't let the pets, them with their pets on the buses or in hotel rooms or whatever. So they decided to stay with their pets. So the second phase of the SPCA facility, we designed it to extremely severe sustainability standards. The energy performance was less than half, the energy consumption was less than half of what we had in phase one. So we were able, within the same budget parameters, to get 100% fully redundant systems. So again, that's not federal budget, it's not Corps of Engineers, but it's an example where if you do things smartly, you can get by with more with less. The perfect example when you get into infrastructure in New Orleans, the decision up until Katrina is let's just keep building higher and higher walls, more and more robust facilities, more and more robust levees. But the fundamental starting point, frankly, was conceptually flawed. It's that every drop of rainfall in the city, we need to collect it, we need to catch it, which usually means big concrete culverts, parking lots going to storm drains, streets going to storm drainage systems, and then we have to spend gobs of money pumping it out of the city. That was not the approach that was taken in the 1800s. It was the approach taken after the technology was developed to do that. And we said, duh, that's pretty easy, we can do all of that stuff. There's an entirely different paradigm shift, if you will, in New Orleans and in a lot of areas subject to intense rainfall, which is to hold the water in the city. Water in and of itself is not a problem. The idea of the bayous, so we dig out areas that are low-lying. We don't, perfect example in New Orleans with a couple notable exceptions, every boulevard where it's two streets with a green space in the middle, every boulevard, the green space is the high point, which means water that comes in, as soon as that water gets saturated, gets dumped into the street, it goes into overloaded pumping stations that can't handle the short-term impact of a 5-inch rainfall in one afternoon, which is what we get in New Orleans, and then the streets flood. So the answer is, well, obviously we have to spend more money, build bigger pumps, bigger systems. That's not the answer. What we have examples of in New Orleans that have long since sort of been forgotten about is the boulevards ought to be, the green space ought to be at the low spot. The pavement ought to drain into the green space, and if it sits there for 2 or 3 days, as long as it doesn't, for us the measurement is it can't sit there long enough to germinate the mosquito larva, which is usually 72 hours. So if you hold water in a green space, why does that matter? We have all of these beautiful parks all over areas of New Orleans and comparable cities that so they flood. So you can't play on the golf course for 24 hours until it naturally drains and subsides. It's a better approach to hold it for a while than to dump everything into the street. Where we're building, pervious concrete costs about $1 a square foot more than conventional reinforced concrete. This concrete that's like Rice Krispie treats. You pour water in the top, it drips through it. Totally acceptable. We had to fight tooth and nail to get it approved by the local authorities having jurisdiction in New Orleans. So perfect example, in one of our facilities, this cost us almost nothing more. Pervious concrete, 4 to 6 inches. In New Orleans, because we have such bad soil conditions, we need 18 inches of compacted gravel. If you can allow the water to go down, that 18 inches of compacted gravel is a perfect holding basin for rainwater. So what we do is we don't make it solid concrete and dump it into an overloaded storm drain. We allow the parking lot to be in effect the low spot because we've got an 18-inch containment vessel essentially over the entire square footage of a parking lot, which might be the size of this room, that might hold a couple 100,000 gallons of water. So the solutions don't always cost money. The solutions in some cases require smarter thinking. Speaking of parking lots, we fought like hell up in Baton Rouge. Simple idea. Most parking, double-loaded parking structures are 65 feet long, which is 65 feet wide, where you've got parking on both sides. It's nominally about 18 feet for the parking spaces and 24, 26 feet in the middle. We said, guys, if we take the final 3 feet, and most cars are less than 18 feet, most trucks are 18 feet or less. Take the final 3 feet of the edge of the parking space where the wheel stop hits. You don't need pavement there. The wheels have stopped. The fact that the car might be hanging a couple feet over grass does not impact your ability to park or move in and out of the space one iota. So we said if you've got two cars that are parked together with the access drives on each end, take the 3 feet from one space, the 3 feet from the other, take that 6 feet, make it grass. Make it we call it a bioswale, but it's otherwise known as a ditch. But if you do it with the right planting material, it's beautiful. Don't make it high and drain to a drain in the middle of the access drive that takes 100% of the water mixed with asphalt and all of that good stuff and dumps it into a storm drain system that requires, in New Orleans, requires 100% of it to be pumped. Nothing gravity drains in New Orleans because we're in a dish-shaped profile. So take that 6 feet, slope it, put a crown in the middle of the parking thing, slope it to there, and allow 25–30% of it to seep into the ground. What does make it in, and put the catch basins in that stretch, and so if it fills up with water, that's fine. Plants like water. A day later, it's all drained. It's not a problem. It requires a different way of thinking about resilient design. With the houses, we found it really isn't much more expensive to build a house 3 feet off the ground than it is a slab on grade. And there's actually practical benefits to building elevated, so we're in effect rediscovering what people knew 4 or 5 generations ago and somehow got forgotten. I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but I do believe that resilient design in a lot of its forms can be cost effective. It just requires a little more creative thinking. We talked about this morning, riding around with you, talked about passive survivability. Perfect example. It's like 200 years ago, less than 100 years ago, every house in New Orleans had operable windows, high ceilings, narrow profile to get cross ventilation and natural light. At some point, when we got fully dependent on 100% power, 100% air conditioning, those features of design that were inherent in designing in hot, humid climates like New Orleans, those got lost, and we ended up with big, wide floor plates. So what happens is then, in the event of a catastrophe, you can't survive in the house because you can't open the windows. They're baking you inside, and the footprint is so much so that there's no way to get any kind of cross ventilation. So sometimes it's just simply a return to common sense standards that work. The SPCA project, the phase 2, we changed. The phase 1 was a big giant footprint like this auditorium is. The phase 2 had little fingers of buildings. It was probably a little bit more expensive because you had the building envelope had a lot more square footage to it, which added some to the cost. But in a lot of office buildings, the biggest energy utilization, or depending on climate, is not air conditioning, it's lighting. So, you know, why not design things to where they can rely on natural lighting? And then if you do get a major shutdown, you can still work in the building. You're not going to have, you're not completely blinded because all you've got is the little battery exit lights. And you can potentially still use the building if it can be properly ventilated. I guess we're having some technical difficulties. So how about some more questions? Yes?
You mentioned with the house, raising them up, there's one of the benefits, obviously flood with the weather.
What we found is that my house is raised, and it's raised a little bit more after Katrina, is that natural ventilation, that in fact, I don't have it at my house, but what some folks have designed is essentially in the wintertime, perimeter panels. It can just be dumb, simple kind of hinged shutters, if you will. Then the wintertime, they're closed off because any heat that's dissipated through the floor is essentially kept in there. So you have kind of an interstitial zone that doesn't get, if it's 30 degrees outside, maybe it'll stay 60, 55 or 60 below there. But the nice thing is in the summertime, you do get the ventilation underneath there. If you have a dog, it's a great spot for your dog to go run and to stay in the shade. But obviously the primary reason is for the water. How about some more questions? Yes?
What kind of energy sources on the grid? Is it renewable energy? Is it plant-fed? How is
Well, I think like most jurisdictions, New Orleans is way, way behind the times in being able to establish some kind of cooperation and being able to sell back to the grid, in being able to establish some kind of a microgrid technology to where you can sustain yourself. The good news in Louisiana is that they've been huge supporters, advocacy for solar, and we can get solar installed effectively between federal and state subsidies. We can get solar installed for 80% off. And that's been a huge thing because although New Orleans is hot, generally it's relatively cloudy and rainy. It's not like Phoenix where it has a high solar potential, but still it's a huge phenomenon in New Orleans. It's amazing how much solar has been coming up. I was going to make another point and I've forgotten it. How about some more questions? So I'll just use some stream of kind. I'm trying to think of some of the slides that we were. Yes?
The first slide showed the acronym factoring.
Oh.
Can you explain what FAIA and LEED, the LEED
Yeah. So yes, thank you. FAIA means American Institute of Architects is it's the licensure and accreditation arm of the architectural profession. Being a fellow just simply means that you've been in it long enough and done something significant enough to it's the highest award that is honored with architects. LEED is the environmental sustainability component, and it's administered by the U.S. Green Building Council. Sustainability is fundamental to everything that we do. In its simplest form, it simply means smart utilization of resources. In some cases, resources includes money. The primary focus is on energy utilization. It just means designing and operating buildings that conserve energy resources. In New Orleans, it's dealing with water, and ironically, in a place like New Orleans, it's dealing with too much water. In lots of areas of the western United States, it means dealing with too little water, but it's very smart utilization of the water that's available. There are also initiatives in LEED that deal with essentially just saving the planet. You know, if we decide we're going to use wood on a project, that wood should come from renewable resources. It shouldn't come from, you shouldn't select species that require you to tear down destroy the Brazilian rainforest. It should come from smartly sort of harvested wood products. And increasingly, just recently, speaking of sustainability, LEED has adopted an energy survivability credit that basically allows you, it's a computer model that allows you to analyze your building and say, okay, if everything shuts down, are you going to be at, is the building even occupiable based on the way you've designed it? So they look at things like natural ventilation, natural lighting. To what degree are you relying on the energy and water that could, what happens if something goes out, and how sustainable are you in that regard? So LEED is getting on the bandwagon in terms of resiliency. One of the things that some of my concluding slides show, I think that one of the many frustrating things that we saw in New Orleans is the result of a sort of a blind eye toward all of the other criteria that affect resilient design and a strict focus on technology. And what we've learned in New Orleans is it's not just about when you're designing resilient facilities, whether you're designing civil engineering infrastructure, be it levees, pump stations, et cetera, in communities. It's not just about technology. It's about understanding the unintended consequences on the environment, and it's about understanding the culture and history of the place. Perfect example, right after the storm, the Urban Land Institute, which was a major institution, some of the smartest planners in the country, came in and said, let us take a shot at this. Let us analyze New Orleans and figure out what's wrong. So the Urban Land Institute comes in and says, we know the problem. You shouldn't have built in these low-lying areas. Well, that's certainly true. And they came up with a map of the city that showed big, giant green dots, a big dot dropped in a neighborhood that said, these are the spots where, from a technology standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, the best thing that you can do is to convert these inhabited areas of the city back to parks. I agreed 100% with that, including the fact that my house, which I built with my own two hands, I'm an architect, my dad's a contractor, my house was located in the middle of one of those green dots because I was prepared to take one for the team if this is what was the smartest solution for the city. What the Urban Land Institute didn't recognize and the city didn't recognize is you're talking about people and people's lives here. So it was the messaging, it was the way in which they failed to build any kind of coalition, the way they failed to engage the community. Now granted, you're talking about a community that was very kind of upset at the fact that their city had flooded and flood walls had collapsed long before they were overtopped. So there was a lot of frustration. But we saw for the first hand the result of just simply looking at a technological solution and not understanding the deeper undertones, which is that in any area that's inhabited, what you're basically getting down to is that basic fight between what are the rights of the individual in this country and what represents the greater good. And those are not always in alignment. And when you get into a fist fight between the two, back up because it's a messy thing. Well, the people that were looking at a technological solution to the city of New Orleans completely missed the fact that of all of the cultural, racial, demographic undertones, but at its core, that you're telling people that you'd never spent 10 minutes with, you need to you might have been in that house for 3 generations, get the hell out, we're taking this over. So understanding the human side of that was huge. Understanding the cultural side of it was huge. So the other thing that as we talk about community connections is that when we're looking at facility infrastructure, these are large, in many cases, large monolithic facilities. Pumping stations that are 3 stories tall, they're pumping out, a third of the water in the city of New Orleans in a spot that's within a mile from my house. I believe the Corps of Engineers, I believe any designers that are affecting the sight lines and the profile of communities have a greater obligation to do things that fit within the culture. They are first and foremost, yes, they're engineers, but they're first and foremost designers. And if you don't understand the cultural and social impact of building things, major things in heavily inhabited communities like New Orleans, then you're not fully doing your job. It's not just about designing the biggest, best, or most cost-effective thing. And not to say that to the point about money, it's always easy to say, well, geez, wouldn't it be nice if we designed a Maserati rather than a Chevy? Sometimes those kinds of things do cost more, but I think it's more important to understand that if we're clever, if we're nimble, if we exercise ingenuity, that in fact we can in fact design better things that fit in our community, things that we can be proud of. And there are examples all over in the Netherlands and at the Thames River outside of London. Beautiful examples, and the Netherlands gets it because they understand this is their psyche, this is who they are as a people, this is a representation of their DNA. They're people that have been fighting with water. So their water structures are they're not just seen as engineering projects that are outside of the realm of public or civic architecture. They're seen as inherent to that, and certainly in a city like New Orleans, we see it the same way. So there has to be a greater good that is served by designers to be able to address that. It can't just be a really efficient, but ugly, as we like to say, pumping station. There has to be some accommodation, even if it's just, the color of the concrete, something that recognizes that these large, not intrusions, these large necessary additions to our urban landscape are critical.
So, you want me to just?
Yeah, just
So, number 2 is critical resources and community assets.
there's an amazing study, and I'm trying to remember where the heat wave was 1995, and I'm forgetting what community it was. Resilience is all about systems, right? It's all about technology. I think it was outside of Chicago. I should know this. 2 adjoining communities with very much the same demographic condition that experienced the exact same heat wave over the exact same period of time, literally next door to one another. One of them had per capita like 10 times the number of deaths. They went back and said, well, this is interesting. When do you ever get a control study where you say, here's case in point A, case in point B, and something as critical as keeping people alive in the event of this terrible heat wave? And what they found is that, in fact, the community that had much fewer deaths, in fact, had community resources available. It was about the people, it was about the neighborhood, it was about the resources that they had, it was about the, they knew their neighbors, and again, I don't know the specifics of it, but it's a fascinating case study where it shows that the only difference, it was not about technology, it was not about design, engineering, et cetera. It was simply about the community's ability to deal with a disaster and their ability to pull together and to share resources. So it's difficult to tie that specifically to what you guys are dealing with at the Corps of Engineers, other than understand that this is not about just X plus Y equals Z, and it's not formulaic. You have to be nimble, you have to understand the communities that you're moving in. We were talking this morning about going into other places around the world, and so you have these amazing designs for facilities that can be set up very quickly, but understanding the recipients of that, understanding what happens when you're gone, understanding the implications of you dropping new facilities into entirely different climates, environmental conditions, and social cultural conditions. Understanding that is as much a part of what you need to do as understanding the engineering side.
Regional and contextual efforts.
The regional, well, yeah, a lot of that we've, I think of, go ahead.
Emergency preparedness.
So we had, the comment after Katrina was it was the storm that everybody had predicted, but nobody was ready for. And obviously you deal with this all the time with the Corps of Engineers, is that to be able to lay out very clearly protocols for response. But what we found is that, I mean, we did that before Katrina, The issue, for me, if you were diagramming, and I think I had a diagram like this, it's this constant loop, and it requires the feedback. So, you know, you think that you're prepared, you think you've got everything covered. Are you doing the systematic analysis after the fact to say, what did we really learn, including the huge mistakes that we made that informs the next set of decision? And that, to me, again, I think is the challenge that you all have is that as a large, the military being a very large institution, monolithic by nature, because if you're controlling tens and thousands of the actions of tens of thousands of people, it can't be, well, let's just flip a coin or let's just take a vote. So it's monolithic because it needs to be. How can it at the same time be flexible and be nimble and be able to accommodate all of the unknowns and all of the changes that occur? There's another slide we're showing that, you know, the idea of resilience used to be thought of 20 years ago, and the diagrams that show it is, you know, you've got a normal condition and then an event. And you go through this multi-phase period that we're all familiar with. And then 2 years, 5 years later, you go through a major event again. The chart that we use is showing this, that the event that you go through at this point in time, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, the baseline by which you evaluate the event has entirely changed. So in New Orleans, 10 years later, you think, okay, we learned from Hurricane Katrina, but in the 10 years since Katrina, we've lost an amazing amount of coastline, and we've had incremental sea level rise. So even the lessons from 10 years ago that you can empirically pull from a very specific event, some of those lessons no longer apply. So being able to deal with a condition where the only constant is change requires a constant rethinking of emergency preparedness and what your response is going to be.
So you may have already discussed, but an environmental analysis and risk assessment is the next one. Site response beyond that.
Yeah, trying to think of ones that specific issues that we hadn't talked about. I'm doing a little bit more rambling than I anticipated. How about some more questions to get an idea of what you guys, yes?
Sir, can you offer any guidance as to retrofitting existing structures for more resilience? For instance, New Orleans, a lot of the structures that remained were still standing, but how do we learn from the lessons of Katrina and make those structures more resilient for energy efficiency as well?
Yes. So the question was, how do we learn existing structures, and after an event like Katrina, how do we improve upon them? How do we really implement the lessons learned? And thanks, because it project that we did, the New Orleans East Hospital, it was an area that got about 6 feet of water in the lower level, 6-story, high-rise inpatient facility with critical care facilities. We went in and based on the analysis, we were also the architects for the VA, a $900 million project in New Orleans that's still under construction. And what we established was a methodology where we said, the first thing we said is our standard of care is a variable. It is not a constant. So we actually, in both hospitals, we said, to what extent will the public see these as areas of last resort? You know, we're not designing for that, but the reality we found is if somebody shows up in a canoe rowing down the street with their injured mother and brings them to an operating hospital, you're not going to turn them away. So what does that mean in terms of a defend-in-place strategy, unanticipated care? And we got two entirely different answers when we evaluated the conditions of each of the hospitals. And the first one in New Orleans, and a much tighter budget. New Orleans East was funded by the city. It was $60 million. The VA, I think, was almost $900 million. What we said is, this is an existing facility. The first thing we're going to do is harden the building envelope. So even though the windows were generally in good condition, we actually did not just meet, we exceeded the new wind load criteria, which had bumped from 110 to up to 130 miles per hour. There's also called a large missile impact criteria on the glazing that was started, I think, from back in Florida. That's the Dade County criteria that essentially involves shooting a 2x4 at 100 miles an hour at the glass. And yes, it'll crack, but it won't shatter and, you know, allow rainwater in. So it's a laminated construction. We accommodated both of those, but that's kind of what all institutions are doing in New Orleans. The clever move that we said is that, okay, we can't assure the neighborhood that flooding won't occur again. This is one of the more vulnerable areas of the city. People have moved back. They do need a hospital. What we established was the entire first floor that we're not going to raise a 6-story building. We're not going to build giant flood walls because this is supposed to be an open facility. I think we called it the friendly fortress. So how do you do something that's robust that people say, oh, I can get there, it's solid, but not something that looks like a bunker? And that's a huge challenge that we have as designers, to provide resilience and hardening, but also not have it look like it is, it should be open and engaging as well. So we just said the entire first floor of the hospital, sacrificial. And it's very painful for a director of nursing to find out that his or her office is sacrificial. But the reality is, we don't need that director's office to be functional if we had another Katrina. We just need that director to have the means to get up to the second floor. So we designed this hospital to continue to run for 72 hours, even in the event of 3 feet or more of flooding on the first floor. And all of the essential facilities, the gift shop, the cafeteria, because obviously you can move food, you can get food to and from. We moved the emergency room up to the second floor because we realized, this was one of those great kind of surprises after Katrina, that on-ramps and off-ramps at Interstate make amazing boat launches. So when you're usually just driving up and driving down, well, in fact, it's the perfect slope to be able to launch a boat, to be able to ride through the city. So we elevated the emergency department, not just to get it out of the harm's way if we had another flood, but also so that they could in fact move boats on and off if they had to. So you could just pull up a boat and trailer up onto the second floor deck, the unloading area and if necessary, you could. Same thing, we have a helipad at grade, but we designed, and this didn't cost us a penny more. We just said, okay, we're not designing a helipad on the roof deck because there are federal standards that would drive the cost up. But what we will do is in a super crisis mode, if the heliport is at grade is under 6 feet of water, we're just going to design the roof with a little bit more pound per square foot in a certain area. We'll make sure all the air handling units on the roof are pushed over, and that wink, wink, nod, nod, the hospital administrators say, well, if we have to, if we got to get somebody in or out of that hospital, we're going to land on the roof. So simple little ideas like that we learned from the lessons of Katrina, that it made it a more resilient facility. But the important thing is that from day one we had the conversation, because the owner's first comment was, we'd like to be defend in place and we'd like to have 7 days of continued coverage. Well, you start running the numbers on that, the size of emergency powered generators, fuel tanks, fuel storage, water storage, sewer storage, all of those things, it just wasn't feasible. So what they did is they redid their emergency their emergency shutdown plan based on a 72-hour rather than a 1-week defend in place strategy, and changed it from a defend in place to what they called orderly evacuation and shutdown. So in 72 hours, they figured they could get everybody out when they needed to. The VA did actually, believe it or not, and it probably cost $10 million just for that line item alone, was they said, no, we're going to do a full defend in place, everything running at 100%. But we borrowed the idea from them, which is, let's just make the whole first floor sacrificial. At the VA, we did what we called an upside down hospital. Actually, didn't cost much more. In most hospitals, the service lines are run slightly below grade or in basements. Well, in New Orleans, that would be a disaster. So we just turned everything upside down, and the uppermost floor, above the 4th floor, the main spine of the hospital, is where we put all of the services and distribution. And in the central plant, same thing. Like, there's nothing in the first floor that can't get wet, so you can put storage tanks there. All of the switchgear, generators, pumps, everything is from the 2nd floor up. So sometimes it's just doing things that we say, well, that's pretty obvious, but Charity Hospital in New Orleans, if you read the news about it, one of the reasons it was Deep Six is because, believe it or not, they designed all of the facilities in the basement, because they were told by the mechanical engineers. Don't worry, it won't flood. We've got all of this special wall conditions in the basement, and we've got a lot of pumps there. Well, they did have a lot of pumps, they had a lot of walls, it's still flooded. So again, sometimes it's just not just doing the obvious engineering answer, but doing things that really, is this really foolproof? Is it really, have we accommodated any possibility of human error, and are we still doing the obvious, like get it up, get it harder, do simple little things like I've described. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, well, my apologies for, I think somebody had asked whether we could get the slides. The slides, if you had seen them, they're really, really nice. So we will make those slides available to you, and thank you so much for your time.
So when we ask you to come today and discuss resilience, what you've done is an exceptional job of describing resilient design. But what you didn't know is that we were going to give you a test to see how personally resilient you were. And I'd like to say that you passed with
I passed,
flying
yep.
colors. So the other thing is our students in the end of course critiques are constantly complaining about two things. One is that they're constantly having computer issues and constantly having bandwidth issues. So for all of you
There we go.
students out there, know that it's not just something that occurs with you. And then the other thing that they're constantly saying is they want more discussion and less PowerPoint slides. So you've delivered.
There we go.
multiple
See that?
aspects there.
The laws
So-
of unintended consequences.
And then finally, we do have a departing gift for you here. It's
Okay.
a book that's very special to us in the Engineer Regiment and the Corps of Engineers. And it's so important that even though it was out of print, we actually had it printed ourselves. And it's been
Wow.
signed by the Commandant of the Engineer School, General Ramers. And
Oh,
it's something
wow.
that I'm
Thank you.
sure you will probably tell everybody about as soon as you get back to New Orleans, and you will probably put it on your shelf and think of us fondly here at the Engineer School and your experiences.
All right.
And the name of the book is called The Damned Engineers. So, no, but it's
Well,
about
thank you.
the story of an engineer unit in the Battle of the Bulge, a small
really?
engineer unit, and
Yeah.
the defenses that they put up with limited resources to defeat a much larger German Panzer
In
division.
Bastogne, huh?
So, right,
Yeah,
so
terrific.
thank you very much.
Well, thank
and,
you. I
thank
appreciate
you
it.
for putting up with all the computer issues.
Thank you, folks.